All right. So thank you, everybody. So again, we're about to go through the July 2025 forms revisions. The reason I say July and point that out is because it's very possible we will have additional revisions before the end of the year. As I mentioned before we started this recording, there is a new law in North Carolina relating to buyer agent compensation, and it can be included in an offer to purchase, a pre-printed offer to purchase now. And so we will likely see either a revision to the offer to purchase, or maybe more likely in the short term, an addendum that the state comes out with to allow us to include compensation in our offer to purchase. This is important and relevant because this helps make sure that your compensation is protected, that the buyer knows whether or not they're going to have to pay you, and allows you to negotiate that as part of an offer to purchase, whereas until now, that was always illegal in North Carolina. So I'll send out, when we send out this recording, I'll send out a copy of this document here, which will link you to all of the revised forms, and as well as gives explanations of the changes. You can find this on the NC Realtors website, ncrealtors.org. Lots of great information there, including all the forms and the summary. But I'm going to go through and hit the highlights. There are some forms that have some minor changes that I'm not going to touch on. I just want to touch on the things that are going to be most relevant and important to you. And I'll take this opportunity to touch on some details that aren't new, but that bear repeating. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Again, if you have questions, feel free to unmute and ask them. It's going to be tough for me to really meaningfully monitor the chat. I will attempt to, but either raise your hand, use the little emoji to raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself, and that's fine.
Can you zoom it in just a little more?
Yes. Yeah, I will when we get to something that we need. I just want you to see kind of real quick, but yes, I will. Thank you, Allison. So the main thing here, there are some changes, but the main thing is they have, again, tried to reformat these forms to make them easier for everybody to read. The new offer to purchase is 14 pages now. It was 17 pages, I believe. So they've consolidated some things. They've moved out a lot of the notes and warnings that were in red and blue. They've either taken that content out and put it in the guidelines, or they've just added it to paragraphs. So there hasn't been a lot that's changed in terms of how this offer works, but you will notice that they've relocated some things. So one of the most annoying things was the seller concessions. That was on like page 11 in our previous version of the offer to purchase. I mean, you had to be a ninja to figure out where that was. They've brought it up to the top. So what they've tried to do is get all the important information on page 1, which makes so much sense. By the way, just a quick point of order, you'll see this version, all previous years, you will have seen a bunch of strike-throughs and highlighted language. The offer to purchase for vacant land, 12T, had similar changes to this offer to purchase. So basically the same thing, but just for the land contract. That one has all the strike-throughs on it. I'll show you that one briefly in a minute. We're not going to go through that one today. This version that you can get on the NC Realtors website only has the highlighted changes. It doesn't have the scratch through, so it's easier to read. That's why we're showing you this version. But they've brought the seller concessions to page 1, the due diligence period to page 1, and the settlement date to page 1. Settlement date was like page 3 or 4 before. So hopefully it stays that way when we get this new revision that'll come out soon. But again, a lot of the stuff that's highlighted is not actually changes, it's just reorganization. And I've got notes on this, so I'll pause to make sure that I'm hitting the highlights, but that'll also give you a chance to, if you have a question, to think of and ask that. All right. One quick note about the due diligence period, because this is actually a change, and it's not on the form, but it's in the guidelines of the offer to purchase. So let me zoom in here. So for the due diligence period, do not enter NA. It has always said that. However, what has been added to the guidelines is that if you leave it blank, then the due diligence period extends through closing. If you put NA, it extends through closing. It does not mean there is no due diligence period. You must put a date in there. If you want the due diligence period to essentially not have one, then put today's date. Okay, put the date of the day you're making the offer. Do not leave it blank or put NA. We literally have had this come up in a current contract where there's no date in there. And everybody is debating on, does that mean that there is no due diligence period or that the due diligence period is infinite? Well, with the new version of the offer and the new guidelines, it is clear, it's been decided, it is infinite. Do not leave it blank. Do not put NA. Please put a date in there.
So then what does that mean to the earnest money?
It means the earnest money would never become, if you left it blank, the earnest money would never become non-refundable. Thank you for
Wish we
asking that.
had that during COVID.
Yeah, right, because a lot of people were leaving it blank or putting NA. So again, put today's date if you want to do that. If you're trying to make it so that there is no due diligence period. All right, one change here or clarification. You might know that there's this issue of when a contract is terminating the earnest money, and for the attorney or escrow agent to release it, you need both parties' written agreement on how that's going to be released. Well, that creates some confusion because it really should be not that both parties have signed off. What if one of the parties has passed away, right? What if the one party becomes non-responsive? So they've tweaked this language to empower closing attorneys to disperse the way that it should be dispersed according to North Carolina law. What the previous version of our contract did is it kind of overshadowed North Carolina law and said you need to have written agreement by both parties. So they've taken that out and said that the escrow agent can disperse it according to North Carolina law if the buyer and seller cannot resolve the dispute by consent. Okay, so it just empowers the attorney. Now, just know the attorney still has the right to do whatever they want. They're the escrow agent. They're going to make the decision on how they're willing to do it. But the contract now empowers them to do that, to follow North Carolina law rather than just requiring a blanket written agreement by both parties, even if one party clearly does not deserve and is not ever going to be owed that money. All right. All right, so we'll keep on scrolling through. We're going to go to the top of page 3. So there's going to be some stuff I'm going to skip over, but it's because there's no material changes there for us to note. All right. In red right here, there used to be a note, I think they had a box that was highlighted. So they've kept this language, but it says the party should not assume that items will be included in the sale based on the statement or advertisement outside of this contract. The point is, just because the listing agent says the living room TV is being included, if you don't put that living room TV, which is personal property, in your contract, guess what? Seller can take it. Nothing you can do. You can say till you're blue in the face, well, he put it in the MLS. Too bad, right? Doesn't matter. That's not part of the contract. So be aware of that. The other thing is all these things are highlighted. The fixtures have not materially changed. I just want to point out this is now, if you remember, our agency agreement was changed in January, our listing agreement. And so the offer was not changed in January. This just now matches the exact language of what's in the listing agreement. So they've just made these the exact same wording. Again, this is a good section for you to read over regularly to make sure you have clear understanding of what fixtures are. I'll always also take this time to mention by North Carolina law, not all of these things are fixtures, but because they are included in the contract, that makes them convey as fixtures as part of the contract. So you don't want to be too smart for your own good and say, well, North Carolina law, here's the stipulations of what makes something a fixture. Well, the fact that it's included in this contract makes it a fixture. So make sure you're very aware of that. All right. This again is not really new. It's been in here. It's just reformatted. This is just a reminder. This is the most common example of solar panels. But if there is something that is not owned or is leased or has a loan against it, so like solar panels is the most common example, or a generator, make sure the seller knows they have to pay that off. If they don't want to, if they think they're going to transfer that to a buyer, that's fine. But there is no standard way for us to do that. So you need to make sure it makes its way into the purchase, into the contract with an attorney drafted addendum. So it's just a reminder on this. We continue to see sellers thinking that, oh, I'm just going to make this the buyer's problem. It's like any other loan. They need to have it paid off at closing. And then just one quick reminder, everyone's favorite phrase from Deb Carpenter, my former broker in charge: when in doubt, write it out. This is not new. but this is a great time to remind you, don't take any chances. If you think it might be personal property, you're not sure if it's a fixture or not, just write it. There is no harm in adding a fixture to this section. All right. That does not in some way do anything bad. It just puts everybody on the same page. So if there's a basketball goal, who cares? Write it in here. Oh, it's cemented into the ground, Brian. It's a fixture. I don't care. Write it in here anyway. Right?
Brian?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I recall seeing a contract one time that it was a little interesting to me because the sellers hadn't cleared out the garage and a few other items. And because it was an estate sale and everything, they weren't sure if they were going to actually get there to be able to clear it out. So they actually kind of wrote in, and any items left on the property at closing, which I thought was interesting. And the buyer had to understand in writing that they were agreeing to accept any items that were, left in the garage, essentially.
That's smart. I love that. I mean, you're putting everybody on the same page, recognizing, because the contract later does say that if there's any trash or belongings left at the property, that would actually put the seller in breach of contract.
Right.
So
They
at
would
least
have to pay to remove it.
That's right. So now we're saying, okay, all of those items are going to be there. So doing it that way is great. Having an attorney draft it up if you feel like the other side isn't understanding what you're putting out there. Yeah, clarity is king here. Just a reminder, also on personal property, North Carolina now has a bill of sale. It's Form 320-T. So if there's more than like a refrigerator and washer and dryer, you should be using that bill of sale. That way the lender doesn't need to see it.
Hey,
Okay,
Brian,
that
I've
bill of
been actually, even though that's available to us, I've been actually, I had a listing with some personal property that was going to be for sale. And I actually uploaded that form to the document section, even though it's available to everybody. And I just added in the private remarks note saying that there is a bill of sale in the document section for other items if a buyer should want those. So just really spell it out.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. It's because it's a new form. The last couple of years, there are a lot of agents still will forget that that's there. So when you're selling a tractor or artwork or whatever, whether it's for free essentially or somebody's actually paying fair market value for it, doesn't matter. Use the bill of sale. You do not itemize the bill of sale in the offer. The bill of sale has language in it that attaches it to the contract and says if the contract doesn't go through, this bill of sale is null and void essentially. So it is only that bill of sale is only going to be in effect if you actually go through with the purchase of the house.
So Brian, just to be clear, you don't reference it on the bottom of where the other addendum, et cetera, would be referenced, correct?
Correct. That's right. Yeah, because you don't want the contract itself contingent on that bill of sale. You don't want the purchase of $1.5 million house to fall through because of a $300 tractor purchase, and the tractor was stolen and is no longer available, and the seller can't convey it. They need to operate separately.
And the whole point is we don't want or need the lender to know about a TV or about a treadmill or whatever. So we don't want to reference
That's
it on
right.
the offer. Yeah. Okay, cool.
That's right. Because even though the transaction on the bill of sale is tied to the contract, in that I don't have to buy these things if I don't buy the house, they are buying them separately. It is, the lender doesn't care about it because a buyer can go to a yard sale and buy a TV if they want, right? So this is a separate transaction, just happens to be the owner of the house that they're buying them from. So it is kind of a unique little carve out there. All right. Again, not new language about the loan not being contingent, the transaction not being contingent, just been moved out of the box. Oh, this is what I was mentioning earlier, right here, where I'm highlighting. The property is being sold in its current condition. So somewhere in your brain, earmark this and know that when somebody says, a client or another agent or whatever says, well, where does it say our property is sold as is? Well, it doesn't use the words as is because as is can have different legal meanings, but it's very clear. The property is being sold in its current condition. So as of the time of this offer. So that's where it is, just for your reference. All right. And then not a whole lot here. Again, nothing really changing. This is just language that's being either pulled out of a note or warning box or has just been reorganized a little bit. All right, let's get to page 13. And just a quick notice on the wire fraud warning, they have simplified this a little bit. But I also just will take this opportunity to mention, this is not necessarily a firm policy, although maybe it should be, maybe it will be. But if you are going to be listing vacant land, so this is not about wire fraud, but while we're talking about fraud, if you're going to be listing vacant land and the seller is not willing or able to meet you in person, call me before you take that listing. I almost want to tell you, if you can't meet them in person, do not take the listing. But there could be situations where it's legitimate. Most of the time it's not. If you've never listed land before, I hate to break it to you, nobody's going to call you to list their land. If you are not marketing for land listings, you are not going to get a random call from somebody who lives in Colorado who inherited property and is now ready to sell it, because you have no background in selling land. So that's not a knock against you. It's just that when things are too good to be true, they usually are. So please be extra careful. From what I gather, the instances of these are actually going up. The legal hotline last week had 5 cases just last week where agents called and were in the middle of being scammed. Listing agents were in the middle of being scammed when they finally, a red flag finally went up and they decided to call and ask some questions. And in several of those, they were calling about something, but they didn't know that they were being scammed yet. It wasn't until the attorney started asking questions that they came to realize they were being scammed. I'm not going to make any judgment on the intelligence of those agents, because otherwise intelligent people can fall victim to being excited about an opportunity, you know? So just wanted to mention that we have to be extra diligent. If you can't meet a person, an owner in person, call me, because probably we shouldn't be taking that listing. All right, any questions about the offer to purchase? Again, nothing catastrophic. I think all really good changes. Moving everything to page 1 was really awesome, and that's the main change there for us. All right, just so you can see what the ugly version of a markup looks like. Oh, that's not before we get there. These are the guidelines, by the way. So if anybody's curious, if you never looked at the guidelines, oh, there's no blanks, but it gives you some really cool tips up here. You know, every change, addition, or deletion to an offer or contract must be initialed and should be dated by both buyer and seller. If numerous changes need to be made, or if the same item, such as purchase prices, change more than once, consider using Form 4T. You know, so there's some really good information here. This is like a document full of just education. 8 pages of what you need to know about the offer to purchase. So if you've never looked at the guidelines, maybe this is your time. Take a look at them. All right, this is what the 12T, this is the vacant land offer to purchase. You can see all these strike throughs. Oh, it's painful to look at. That's why we had the more cleaned up version for the standard 2T. But if you do sell vacant land, take a look at that. It's basically the same reorganization stuff we saw with the standard offer to purchase. All right, moving along. And we're going kind of like the biggest changes to the least biggest changes, roughly in that order. All right, listing agreement form 101. Let me go ahead and fast forward here to the middle of page 2. There's been one form that has been suspended. It may make a comeback, but for now, form 105 no longer exists. Chances are you don't know what that is. Chances are you never used it, but it was a form you could use to limit the advertising on a property. Nobody was using that form. They've done away with it. If you want to limit advertising, so let's say, I don't even have a great example for you. But if a seller said, I don't want the listing on your website, or something like that, I don't want it advertised on Facebook, let's say. There's no longer a form for you to use for that. You would just simply go to section 19 of our contract, which is the additional provisions section. Let me just show you. Where are we? There we go. Additional terms, section 19. This is where you could write anything else in here. So if you needed to say, firm agrees not to advertise your home on Facebook, you would write that in here, okay? Minor change that you probably never knew about. But on the off chance someone here loved Form 105, just know that it's gone. All right, let's jump into top of page 3. There's been a new bullet here added for fees. This is the ability to add an attached firm's fee schedule. So if you had a complicated way that you are charging a seller, let's say if the house sells for $700 or for $699.99 or less, my compensation is this. And if it sells for $700 or more, my compensation is that. If you had something that was more complicated like that, you could attach a separate thing here. Just remember that we've seen more agents charging transaction fees lately. That's fine. But if you're charging a percentage, you put your percentage in here. And then if you're charging other fees, whatever they are, then you would say, and it says specify name and amount. So transaction fee, $500 or whatever it is, you would put it in there. Okay, so most of the time you're not probably going to need this additional item or box. Just want you to know that it is there. The other thing I'm going to mention while we're here is that most of the time, when you're doing cooperative compensation, this is what you're offering to a buyer's agent, what a seller or listing firm is offering to a buyer's agent. Most of the time, you should be using this middle option. Seller, I don't know why it's not letting me highlight it. There we go. Seller may offer blank percent or a flat amount of blank rather than it going through the firm. So remember, the first option is that the firm is paying it. But if you've ever looked at a closing disclosure, you know the buyer agent compensation never runs through the listing firm anyway. So I don't know why our paperwork still relates to that old way of doing things. You know, and for those of you who've been in real estate longer than me, you know, there was a time in which the entire commission would go to the listing firm and the listing firm would disperse to the other firm. And then they would send out 1099s to those firms at the end of the year. But it doesn't work that way anymore. The attorney just distributes it at closing. It never runs through the listing firm. So why would we ever check this box? There are other reasons why we don't want to check that box. If the contract falls through, there can be claims of unjust enrichment, meaning that we could, if we, the listing firm, were the ones paying the other firm, we could somehow end up on the hook for paying that firm, even though a contract falls through. You know, there's just no reason for it. The seller should be paying it directly. That's the way it's going to be done on the closing statement anyway. So 99.9 times out of 100, you're going to check this middle box that says seller may offer whatever they're going to offer. If they're going to offer anything, obviously you'll have that conversation with them. You and the seller will decide, are they going to offer compensation? And then it says they may offer that. So just wanted to point that out. That's the method you should be using there. Another just quick change down here in terms of total cost. It's optional because a seller may not have buyer agent compensation in the listing agreement. They may decide to pay it, but it may not be documented here in the listing agreement. So putting anything on this blank is optional, but they've eliminated this line that said firm's fee plus cooperative compensation because it was confusing if there was no cooperative compensation included up here. Okay, makes sense. So if you're charging X percent up here, right? Firm's fee, this is just listing fee. This is not listing fee and buyer agent fee, just listing fee up here. If you're charging X percent and the seller is saying they're not going to offer anything to buyer agent compensation, down here you would just put X percent. Okay. If they are offering Y percent, then you're going to put XY percent down here, whatever X and Y equals, whatever the addition of those letters equals. Does that make sense? Any questions there? I know that part hasn't really changed, but I wanted to take this opportunity to go through that. All right.
Brian,
yes.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind. So just for my clarification, I apologize if I wasting people time. If you're taking a listing and you're saying Choice Residential, just as a for instance, we're going to charge 3%. And then you're checking this second box, you know, that the seller may offer compensation to the cooperating agent, buyer's agent, whatever percent, right? So you've got that filled in too. Now, somehow, some way, say you have an open house, unrepresented buyer comes in, says to you, the listing agent, hey, can you put an offer in for me on this house? And you say to him, well, you know, I got to disclose to you, I'm representing the seller. And the buyer says, I don't care. This is what I'm willing to pay. Will you put the offer in for me? So you do. I mean, that's, you're working for the seller. That's what the buyer wants. You put it together, you put it in. Are you then basically, you're getting just that percentage that the firm said that they get, right? You're not getting the other end of it. You're just getting that, whatever it was, that say 3% or whatever. Is that correct to say?
Correct.
Okay. That's fine. Thank you.
You do not represent that buyer. Now, as a listing agent, you could choose to have a different compensation if there is an unrepresented buyer involved in the transaction. So your listing firm's fee could be X percent and then X plus 1.5% for if there's an unrepresented buyer. So you could document that here.
You would likely have that conversation up front when you're taking the listing, more than likely, or
Correct.
no? Okay.
you better, because there's no reason they should agree to pay you more if you bring it up later. So yes, you'd want to have that at the time of taking the listing. Full transparency is the goal of all of these changes with the seller.
Fair enough. Thanks.
And while you're on it, you wouldn't want to go into dual agency with that buyer just in order to receive additional money. That creates all kinds of fiduciary issues. What are the reasons that you're entering into dual agency, which is why you'd want to address the unrepresented buyer situation up front with your seller. And it makes sense. Unrepresented buyer, you as an agent are going to do more work. No question about it. Potentially a lot more work. So logically, there could and should be a difference in compensation there. All right, let me jump down to the bottom of page 4. And dual agency, this section, the only change here was to just make it match what is in the buyer agency agreement. So now the wording is exactly the same. Nothing has changed in terms of our firm's policies at Choice. So if anybody's watching this recording not at Choice, talk to your broker in charge in your firm. But for us, you're going to be initialing the second blank here in the first part, which says that we may act as a dual agent. And you'll be initialing the third part, the third blank down here in the second section, which says they're directing us to act as designated dual agents. That can be changed later. There are rare instances where you could be working with a buyer and already today, and tomorrow you take a listing and that listing happens to be the perfect fit for the buyer, and you're already now representing both of them. And so you could actually end up representing both the buyer and seller. Now you could choose not to, you could still choose to refer it out to another agent, but that could be one of those rare situations where you just full disclosure to everybody. They all understand what's going on. They're all at peace with that. You can amend your agency agreement to then say that the agent is authorized to represent the buyer and seller in dual agency. So it can be amended later, but 99.99% of the time at Choice, your agency agreement should begin with this blank being initialed, which is the second in the first section, and then the third blank in the second section. All right. All right, and last thing we're going to get to here, head over to the bottom of page 6. So they, to everyone's delight, they have, well, we'll see if you're delighted or not, they have attempted to clarify this paragraph to stop confusing sellers, to try to make it clear that the sellers are only responsible for inspections they want to have prior to taking the listing. If they want to have a home inspection or a survey done, this is saying, hey, your agent, they may order it on your behalf. They are not responsible for it. If you want it done, you're paying for it. So they just tried to add some clarity to that section. Again, that was always in the guidelines. Explanations of what that paragraph meant was always in the guidelines. And that's where you could get it. Or you could call Brian, and Brian will tell you, hey, don't worry, walk your sellers back off the ledge. They don't have to pay for the buyer's home inspection. And just so you can see the guidelines for the listing agreement, here they are. Explains everything you'd ever want to know about how to fill out that form.
I just get excited when my clients ask me questions because I know they are reading the form, which I love.
Yes, and clients seem to be reading our paperwork more than they ever have in the past, based on the questions I get. So, yep, that is good. All right. Any other questions about the listing agreement? Awesome. All right, not a new form, but total overhaul on how it's organized, hopefully so that you'll actually use it. This is the seller estimated net sheet. The version, it's hard to read. For some reason on this version, they have white letters here, and then it's highlighted. But it says pre-marketing expenses, mortgages and liens, and closing expenses. These are the 3 sections. And then this form is formatted so that the math will be done for you in DotLoop. So as you start to fill this stuff out, it will automatically calculate these estimated proceeds for the seller. If you don't use a net sheet, please use one. It is actually a huge deal. If God forbid, if for those of you selling during the Great Recession, many sellers showed up to the closing table with money. They had to show up with a check. Most sellers are not expecting to do that today. But when you get a phone call from somebody that bought their house in 2022 or 2023, it is possible they could be bringing money to the table. And you want to make sure you have gone through this with them. Failure to do that is a failure in your fiduciary responsibility. So if you are not using this version of a net sheet, make sure you are using some version of a net sheet. I have shared many times in the past the version I used. much simpler than this. But simple isn't always better. More line items, a detailed analysis of what they're going to take away is probably a good thing. So either use this or use some version of it with your sellers. This one's nice. It'll do the math for you, and you can put in multiple sales price scenarios. And again, it is in DotLoop and already mapped out for you. And in fact, I think I added it yesterday to the listing loop templates. So it should be up there in the miscellaneous folder right there for you. All right. A great change for the buyer agency agreement. Look at this beautiful highlighted language that should make many of you happy. A bonus of blank percent of the property's gross sales price or blank dollars if offered and paid by a seller or builder. So now you finally have a way, if a builder is offering a bonus, for you to include that in full disclosure to your buyers up front when you're signing up to work with them, and you're not scrambling later when you call me and say, hey, Brian, they're offering me X percent, which is in my agency agreement, but they're also offering a $5,000 bonus. What do I do? You can now put this in here. Now, I know that the question that comes up is, well, how do I know what the bonus is going to be? Well, you don't. But the good news is the buyer is only on the hook to pay you what you put in here, okay? This fee of blank percent or a flat fee, okay? That's what they're on the hook to pay you. This one, the bonus, is only if offered and paid by a seller or builder. So you could literally put 10% and $100,000 in here. That should probably cover most bonuses that a builder would ever offer. Now, don't put that. That's a little outrageous and ridiculous. And if I was a buyer, I'd be like, what neighborhoods are we looking at where this is what they're offering as a bonus? But you could, whatever you have seen out there in the world, if that's I don't usually see percentages, but you guys see more than I do. Usually I see some kind of flat dollar amount bonus. So you could put something in there, and then you just point out this is only if, like I would, if I was in my version of this form that I had in my buyer agency packet, buyer presentation, I would have that highlighted in yellow saying, if offered and paid by a builder, seller or builder. So this is not something you would ever be responsible for paying. If they offer it, this is just saying that my firm is going to receive it. Allison, question.
So in this particular case, we can put a higher number knowing that we can accept up to that number, just like what we've been doing for the percentage. We can only take up to that number. That's why you're saying put the higher numbers in there?
Correct. Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
Because if you put 5,000 and they offer a $10,000 bonus, I would argue that you can only receive 5,000.
Okay. And then what if we're giving that bonus to the buyers?
So if your intention is always to only receive the amount of your compensation that you're putting in here as a percentage or a flat fee, then I would say there's no reason to even put anything in here for a bonus. The only reason I could see putting, because if your intention is to give it to the buyer anyway, then you're just going to say, look, if my fee is X, but if they pay a bonus, I'm just going to give that back to you. Now, the only reason why you might want to still put it in there is because the builder might say, well, it wasn't in your agency agreement that you were going to get paid that, so we're not going to pay you that bonus. We'll get to a document in a minute, a new form we have for what to use when a builder says, hey, give me a copy of your agency agreement, and you don't want to. We have a new form for that now. But I would probably err on the side of, if your plan is to just give a bonus back to the buyer, you probably don't even need to put anything in there. Go ahead, Allison.
So I don't know if any of you are getting the emails from Lennar that's paying 5%. So I'm getting, they're over in Nightdale or somewhere. I mean, it's an area that I don't work in, so I just kind of delete it and I have my own feelings about Lennar. I think it's funny that they suddenly now need us. So in that case, if you show your client a Lennar property that's offering you 5%, can you somehow finagle that as the bonus, or do you need to put it in that that's the fee?
Yeah, well, you're probably not going to put, regardless of what the specific numbers we're talking about here are, you're probably, unless you're filling this document out right before you're going to like write a contract with Lennar, like you just know that that's what you're doing. You're setting this up to match that specific thing because you know that's where you're going. then you could put that in as the fee. But otherwise, your fee, if a builder is offering a higher than common amount, what you put in here is likely going to be lower than that. And so you would capture that additional money by having it as a bonus. So if you put, you know, to use just made up examples, if you put 8% in here as your fee and the builder was offering 10%, then if you had a 2% bonus in here, to me, that encompasses that 10%. The 8% you were charging, the 2%, those together equal the 10% the builder is offering. Again, these situations, I mean, most of the time bonuses are flat fees from what I see. Now they may offer a higher compensation amount. This is where the state would say, well, you should know what is happening in your local market. What are builders doing in the areas you serve? And then you can account for that. This is not a perfect system still, but it is much better than what we had before. Na'aku.
And so basically we're going to be projecting what we estimate bonuses are based on, you know, what new construction is given in our area for that line that says a bonus of, long before we even show our client that house or that potential new build.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So you're kind of just what could it be? The protection is that it says if offered and paid by seller or builder. So there's no risk that the buyer would ever be responsible for it. They're only responsible for your normal fee that you're putting in here. All right. Awesome. So I'll just one last quick note, because we're going to get to the agency amendment document shortly. You can amend a buyer agency agreement. However, you are not supposed to amend your buyer agency agreement just because the compensation being offered is more than what you put in your agreement. So if we assume that Y is higher than X, okay, Y is a larger number than X. And so if I put my fee is X and a seller is offering Y, I can't amend my agreement to say to make it Y just because they're offering it. So you need to put the fee that you expect to be paid that you believe is fair for the services you're providing to your buyer. That's what you expect to be paid. You can now add a bonus if you believe that a bonus is likely to be offered in the market this buyer is looking, but you cannot just amend it just because somebody's offering you more money. You are telling the buyer up front on day one what your services cost. They are agreeing to that. So just be aware of that. Like legally, yes, the paperwork allows you to amend your compensation. But the rules of the settlement say you can't amend it just because somebody's offering you more money.
But we can accept less than what's there.
You can absolutely accept less than what is there. And if somebody's offering more money, you can absolutely give that to the buyer. All right, so that's it. Those are all the changes for the buyer agency agreement. That's the one form where they added something that I think is really great and will make your lives easier. And there'll be more nuance. I'm sure we will talk about this on weekend wrap-up calls, what agents are putting in here, that sort of thing. So you can start to hone in on what feels right for everybody. But I would encourage you to be putting something in here for the bonus if there's any chance your client could be looking at new construction. All right, just real quick on the FHA VA financing addendum, nothing catastrophic here, but just wanted you to be aware as to why this form shows up as a change. They've just made the language in the VA financing section match what the VA actually wants it to be. The language wasn't, North Carolina apparently had their own spin on the language. It is now exactly matches what the VA wants. Doesn't mean your client still isn't going to have to sign the VA amendatory language document that the closing attorney or lender is going to give them, but now it matches. All right, real quick, and I'm only going to show you one possession form, but for all of the possession, whether seller or buyer possession forms, there's just now an item in here that says a statement that says seller agrees to comply with section 2C of the contract. 2C talks about unpairing smart devices. So if a seller is possessing the property after closing, seller has to unpair at the time they relinquish possession whenever they move out. If it's buyer possession before closing, they have to unpair smart devices before the buyer moves in. So the seller, it's not when it closes, which is what the contract would have kind of indicated before. So seller has to unpair those devices when the buyer takes possession. I just want to reiterate, this is really important. It is a felony for a seller to listen to somebody else's conversation. So if they did not unpair it, if they had any way of listening in because of those things, there could be really significant legal implications, like jail time. I mean, it is not a joke. It's a legitimate crime to
Shit.
listen in. So take that with you as you advise sellers during open houses and during private showings. I've had questions about whether or not putting a sign up at the property that says you're being recorded and audio, video and audio, is that sufficient? I don't know. I'm not an attorney. I would tell sellers, do not listen. Even the question is there an expectation of privacy? And if I put a sign up, does that remove the expectation of privacy? I don't know. But otherwise, generally speaking, agents and their clients have an expectation of privacy during their showing of your home. Yes, Nancy.
Is that just inside the home? Because a lot of sellers have those Ring cameras. And I mean, there's even funny memes like, people are putting tape over their buyers' mouths as they approach the home because they have a Ring doorbell. Don't say anything. Don't say anything.
Yeah, so I don't know, again, the legal answer there. The way I would advise a seller is, yes, it applies to the front porch as well. If there's an expectation of privacy inside the home, I would say on that private property, even if it's outside on the front porch, there's still an expectation of privacy. So not one that's worth messing around with. We've had cases where agents have called, I mean, hopefully our agents haven't done it, but where we've gotten calls or emails from other agents saying my seller was listening to the clients and they said XYZ. And it's like, you literally just committed to committing a felony or admitted to committing a felony. So there is clearly a lack of understanding about this in the industry. Every state has different laws, but for us, only one party has to agree, but that seller is not a party of the conversation. So they're not allowed to listen in. All right. So just be aware for unpairing devices equally as big of a concern. Make sure, don't gloss over that part. Make sure your sellers understand they need to do that. And it's not always easy to do, by the way. I moved last year and like figuring out how to, undo stuff isn't always intuitive, but it's their legal responsibility to do it. All right. I'm just adding this one. Vacant land disclosure, because a lot of people still don't know that it exists. So if you're selling vacant land, there's the equivalent of the residential property disclosure. There is now a vacant land disclosure. It is required. They just added initials. Somehow they released the form without having the proper initial blanks. But now they have those. But just so you know, this form exists. It is required. Make sure you have it if you're listing or selling land. All right, agreement to amend contract. Two quick things. What's been added is the ability to remove a buyer or seller from the contract. So previously we would just like strike through or have an attorney create an addendum. There's now a simple way to remove a buyer or seller. You'll see up here, previously there was already a way to add a buyer. There is still currently no way to add a seller. It seems like that will eventually show up. But for now, if you need to add a seller or change the seller, you're going to need an attorney drafted addendum to do that. But if you are just removing a buyer or seller, you can do it with the agreement to amend contract now. All right, pretty significant change to the termination forms. So there used to be 6 termination forms. There are now 3. So you have forms 350, which is what we're looking at here, 352, and 390. We used to have separate termination forms for the standard offer to purchase and the vacant land offer to purchase. There is now, they have combined those, and you'll see they don't have it highlighted, but what they've done is there's one line item here that says for form 12T only. All right. So there's one of these options that is specifically only for 12T, the vacant land, and then one of these options that is specifically only for 2T, the standard offer to purchase. And this has to do with receipt of disclosures. The rest of them apply to all of the forms. So it's just a little bit of reformatting here, the addition of those couple of lines. Otherwise, this is the unilateral termination. So this is a notice from the buyer to the seller that they're terminating. Okay. And then 352 is the other way around. This is the seller giving notice to the buyer that they are unilaterally terminating. That's right. There are some times when a seller can actually unilaterally terminate, such as what's the main one? Not delivering the due diligence fee on time. Again, just a slight reformatting here. They've separated these where the seller is terminating. They might be doing it illegally, but they don't care. They're terminating anyway. All right. The major overhaul or significant overhaul was to Form 390. This is the mutual termination. It is now just called termination agreement. But that means mutual termination. Buyer and seller have agreed to terminate the contract. Now, you're going to be using this form when a buyer and seller have agreed. So you don't just fill this out and send it over to the listing agent without them knowing it's coming. This means you and the listing agent have talked. Buyer and seller have come to some kind of agreement. They're not going to sell the house to each other or buy the house from the other one anymore. They've agreed this transaction is no longer happening. Okay. Then you're going to fill this form out. Now, as part of that agreement, they may have agreed on how the earnest money is going to be distributed. They may be splitting it. It may go all to one party, whatever it is. Okay, this is a total reformatting of the form. So if it looks different, that's why. But either the buyer and seller do agree, we check this box, or they do not agree, and we check this box. It goes on to say, if the parties do agree, so if we check the first box, then this is how it's going to be dispersed. All to one person, split up, doesn't matter. This is what we're doing with the earnest money. All right, they've agreed on this. I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's important. So buyer and seller are terminating the contract. They've agreed, and they've agreed on what's happening with the earnest money. Great, we're all happy. Then there could be other terms. You know, is the due diligence fee being refunded because they didn't tell me that there was a pavers and a greenhouse built on top of my septic lines, or whatever it is, and so they are agreeing to return the money. You would itemize that here. Great. Everybody signs, contract terminated, money's going where it's supposed to go. We're all happy. However, they could also agree that, hey, we're not transacting anymore. You're not buying my house. I'm not selling you my house. We're all in agreement on that. But I don't agree with you on what's happening with that earnest money. I think I have that money coming back to me. So we do not agree on it. Therefore, we do not fill out these blanks here in the middle of the page, but we can still sign this termination. Right? We've agreed that we are terminating the contract. The only thing not in agreement is what's happening with the earnest money. Below this dotted line, there is a release of earnest money. If you read this part B up here, it says, if the parties do not agree, then buyer and seller retain any rights, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so they retain their legal rights. The parties may use the release below, so the final sentence, may use the release below the dotted line at the bottom of this form to direct payment of the earnest money at a later date. So this means they've terminated the contract, they bicker back and forth for another couple of weeks, and then they finally say, okay, well, neither one of us really want to get an attorney now that we've cooled down. Let's just go ahead and settle this and move on with our lives. Now they can use this as a way to tell the escrow agent, all right, we've agreed on how to return this money. So if they agree on how to do it, they're signing right here, done. This bottom part, nobody will sign because they've already agreed. This bottom part is like a coupon that you can cut off later if you want and release the earnest money at a later date. I mean, you can tell by the way it's worded. Buyer and seller have now reached an agreement. That means they didn't before. When they signed up here, they had not reached an agreement on the earnest money, but now they have. All right, does that make sense? All right, I can see confusion will happen from this later on. Somebody's going to send the form like, oh, but they didn't sign the bottom. Well, yeah, because we've already agreed to it up here. You don't have to sign the form twice. All right. Good. You guys were good on those then. Again, another good move. They went from 6 forms to 3. That was a good move. We are moving right along here. All right, the agency agreement and amendment. There are just some additional options here. The formatting's a little bit different. Let me zoom in here. So I talked earlier about you can change compensation. So if you remember the old agency amendment form, it was basically just this other amendment section. It was basically extend the listing agreement date, change the price, or a bunch of blank lines for you to write into. All right, that was the way this form looked before. they've now given us some check boxes and some options to make it look more similar to the other forms we have, the other amendments we have. We still have the extension. We can still change the list price. Okay, those two, right? The extension of our term of the listing agreement and the list price, those are the things that are the same as before. Now we can change the firm's compensation. Remember, this is just the listing firm's compensation. We can change that. We can change the cooperative compensation. Okay, so if we want to make changes to what's in our listing agreement, we can do that specifically with those boxes. Dual agency. This is where I mentioned before. We should be starting our agency agreements with both buyers and sellers as seller agrees to dual agency and they direct us to behave as designated dual agents. Okay, but there are times where that could change. Most of the time it won't, but there are times where it could. If it does, no problem. We come in here, we adjust our agency agreement. Okay, we amend our agency agreement to account for that very specific situation you've just found yourself in. And then the other amendments we still have, and you can write any other changes that you might want to be writing in there. Let's say that you retroactively want to do something about an unrepresented buyer. You can now have that option. And then a new box, survival and effective date. All other terms and conditions of the agreement, including any previous amendments to the agreement, are not specifically amended herein and shall remain in full force. So just remember that this comes up when there are multiple amendments. And we want to say that the previous amendments that we may have had to the agreement or everything else that exists in the agreement all survives us making this change. So don't overthink that box. I feel like this could have been pre-printed language and not giving you a box. I would just ignore that we even really have a box here. In fact, my guess is they may remove that. To note that all previous amendments and everything else within the listing agreement survives this change. But this is a much better agency amendment form. So I'm glad they updated that. Any questions about that? All right, new form time. We have two new forms we're going to show you. One that may be more relevant than the other, but both of them were needed. And then we're going to get you out of here. All right, new form 725, Statement of Agency Relationship and Compensation. This was created basically exclusively for your interactions with builders who are asking to see your agency agreement, and you don't want to show it to them, which is a fair feeling to have. Why should they be privy to your agency agreement? This is now a form that basically you get to give the builder the information they want. All right, what is the compensation that's outlined in your agency agreement? Now, by the way, this needs to match it. So don't lie. You can get yourself into trouble if your agency agreement says X and then you put Y in this. All right, you'll get yourself in hot water. Don't do that. Make sure it matches. And then it's optional if you want to have your client sign it or not. It seems, I mean, I get why they made it optional. Seems like if you want to make this seem legit to the builder, you would have your buyer sign it. So that's my 2 cents on that. Probably most of the time you're going to have them sign it. You don't need to give them any contact information. Let me just say that this may or may not satisfy a builder. So don't get your hopes up. They may say, what is this stupid thing? You know, I asked for your agency agreement. You know, hopefully we don't have to fight that battle a lot. If you do, let me know. Hopefully this will solve the problem, but I just want you to realize builders haven't agreed to this. Builders weren't part of the conversation to write this form. So to my knowledge, right, they're not part of that. So, but consideration was given to what is the information they're trying to ascertain. This document provides it. So hopefully it proves to be helpful. Mercedia, you had your hand up.
License number?
Did you say form number?
Should have a license number. Oh yeah, that's
Okay, well, I heard Gene mentioning license number. Yes, this of course is just your real estate license number. They would be flabbergasted if you gave them your driver's license number. So, but as Nancy showed us, when you get pulled over, you just give your real estate license anyway. But Mercedia, did you have a question? Okay. Just keep in mind, it does match the buyer agency agreement. So as we talked before, we're going to have to kind of, as a group, we will continue talking about what we're seeing, what we're putting in here, what experiences you're having. This is why it could make sense to have a bonus just pre-built into your agency agreements, because then it's right here. The builder sees that the buyer had already agreed for you to receive that bonus.
Hey, Brian.
Yes.
What's interesting to me is this change that's coming down the line for buyer agency compensation being part of the contract. I have people that I know in New York. They recently had a property and they were selling and they wanted me to look it over. And I said, okay, I'll look over this contract. And I said, oh, wow, this is cool. In New York, it is, as it's going to be here in North Carolina shortly, part of the offer to purchase where the buyer agent is putting in, yeah, hey, you understand I'm the buyer agent and I'm asking you for X% that you will pay based on the price. And that is signed. That's part of the real estate contract. There's a section in there with the other addenda, whether you're going to have a home inspection or whatever, and they call it the compensation, buyer compensation agreement as part of the contract. And it's boom, it's part of the contract. So it's covered.
That's right. Yeah, there are lots of states that have this as part of it. It makes sense if you're asking it to be a seller expense. Why is it not documented on the offer? I will say this is recorded mostly just to our agents, but I will give kudos to the Real Estate Commission. They do seem to be acting quickly on this. When the settlement first came out, there were a lot of us that said the obvious solution here is making compensation part of the offer to purchase. That seems like the obvious top of the totem pole, most logical thing to do. And then everyone wondered, well, how long is it going to take for that to actually happen? Kudos to the North Carolina legislature for getting that done and for the Real Estate Commission to be jumping on that quickly. It sounds like we will have material changes here pretty soon. So, Marilyn.
Hi, I just unmuted myself. Okay, so I just had a question about the second to last form. Is that equivalent to our current form 770 where we would make a change in price?
So which form? The agency amendment or what?
Second to last, I think agency amendment.
Okay, so 770 is no longer exists.
Okay.
770 has been what do they call it? Twilight. Yeah, it's been suspended or eliminated.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead we have this form.
Moonlighted. Is that the word I'm looking for? Yeah, 770 is gone. It just no longer applies with the settlement term, like with a lot of the changes that we've had. So yes, that's this 710. So this is form 710. I didn't give you the number before. So it's not a new form. It's always been the agency agreement, agency amendment. And you'll notice up here at the top, it's for every single agency agreement you might have. This is what you use to amend it. That's why it has this other amendments, because there are lots of things that will not apply to some of these other, like a tenant representation agreement. Yes, this is the one you use for every single agency amendment.
So this would be the best one to use for a price change.
Correct.
Okay, perfect.
And thank you for saying that, because
Yeah.
we get a lot of price changes that aren't accompanied by paperwork. Remember, when your seller says that they want to change the price from 500 to 475, this is the form you use to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Mhm.
All right, last form. We're gonna get you out of here unless you have other questions. Of course, I'll open it up for questions. Happy to answer whatever you have. But the last form, it's amazing. I actually was shocked and didn't even think about it that this didn't exist before. But this is the agreement to amend contract for new construction. So 800T is our new construction offer to purchase. There is now a specific form to amend the new construction offer to purchase. So this is form 804. But as you can imagine, new construction has very different terms than a resale offer to purchase. And we now have all the specific items that we can amend for that. So just be aware of that. I realize it's not a form you use a lot. But if you're doing a pre-sale with a builder that is not a large national or regional builder, it is not uncommon to be using the standard new construction offer to purchase. So you need to be aware that if changes need to be made, we now have this amendment specific to that. By the way, if the way to figure out, we have so many forms in North Carolina, go into DotLoop and scroll or type in keywords. You'll learn about new forms that exist that you may not have been aware of. It's a great way for you to find that, because these forms revisions don't change every single form. And so there could be a form that hasn't been changed in a decade and you just aren't familiar with. I encourage you to do that as you're reading through these forms, as you're reading through the guidelines. Also, just scroll through the list and see what's in there. So So that's it for the changes. Like I said, when I send out the recording, I will send this out as well, the summary of the changes, so you have that. With that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that you guys have, and I'll take a look at the chat in case there's anything in there. So I'll go ahead and start chiming in. If you have a question, just throw your hand up. I'm going to start going through the chat. Sahara mentioned that in Carteret County, they're still going through the listing firm quite often. Yes, that is a way. The more, well, it doesn't matter what types of firms or locations will do that. I will tell you the way the industry is moving is not to have buyer agent compensation going through the listing firm. It just does. There are so many reasons why it doesn't make sense. The settlement was just like the most recent reason why it doesn't make sense. But from a legal perspective, there's no reason why we want our firm or you to be on the hook for compensation going to the buyer agent when it's the seller in reality paying it directly anyway. So our paperwork should match what is happening in reality. Now, I have voiced my opinion to the North Carolina Association of Realtors that they should eliminate the option for the listing firm to pay the buyer agent the cooperative compensation. They should eliminate it altogether. They have perspective on why they think there are situations where it makes sense. I disagree with it, but I'm not in the room, so we'll see what happens. I wouldn't be surprised if it evolves over time to remove that option. I don't think there's a strong case as to why it should ever run through the listing firm. It should always be the seller paying it directly. And again, our policies will probably reflect that at some point. As you know, I just made a bunch of changes or updates to our policies. Don't really feel like doing it again right now. I'll just continue to educate you on that. Oh, can you make the screen bigger? Sorry, Carrie, I'm just seeing that now. Thank you, Allison, for mentioning that earlier. Hopefully I made it big enough for you guys to see. All right. In early 2000, rolled around. They were begging us. Oh, let me mention this. Alex mentioned, or no, Gina mentioned 2008. Unrelated to something else. You may remember several years ago, our contingent offer addendum disappeared. They did that because as we moved to a due diligence contract and we moved out of a buyer's market and into a seller's market, nobody was using the contingent offer addendum because it protected the buyer's earnest money 3 days beyond the scheduled closing date. And no seller was going to be willing to accept that. And so because it wasn't being used, the state decided, let's just go ahead and sunset that form. And they got rid of sunset. That's the word I was looking for. So they got rid of that form. There are people wanting to know, agents now wanting to know, why don't we have a contingent offer addendum? So they are talking about the possibility of bringing that back. We'll see what happens there. Just know for now, and what happens is people move from other states where there are contingent offers, and so they get confused. That's why there was some tweaking to the language in the offer to purchase about nothing in here is contingent on you getting a loan or a house selling. Okay. There's nothing about that specifically. It is contingent on everything and nothing. That's what a due diligence contract is. And so what agents tend to do is they use the due diligence period to buy the amount of time they need to make sure that the buyer's home has sold or is under contract. Agents just were doing that instead of using the contingent sale addendum. That's why it disappeared. There is talk about it coming back. You know, as the market swings, you become more of a balanced or buyer's market. All of a sudden, people are wanting these additional tools. So I won't opine on that any further, but just to give you a little context. All right, is that inside or outside? Okay. Can the agency amendment be used? So I did cover this, but yes, the agency agreement can be used to change buyer agent compensation. Again, let me touch on that. So thank you, Carrie, for that question. When is it okay to change your buyer agent compensation, to amend that? It's not okay if the type of property you were searching or the terms, the conditions under which you started working for that buyer, if those haven't changed, then you shouldn't be changing your buyer agency compensation. So when you might be able to do it, when it could make sense, could be, well, you signed buyer agency and the idea was that you were going to look at one property. And now we're 3 months in, you've looked at 27 properties. Yeah, we need to amend our agency agreement. The compensation I agreed to based on that criteria, those circumstances, is different than the compensation I would agree to given the current status of our relationship. Now we need to change it. or, you know, maybe it was type of property. They were just looking for land. And now all of a sudden they're looking for a fixer upper or foreclosures, right? So the scope of what they're looking for has changed. Then it would make sense that what you charge could be different. So that would be a time where it could make sense. And again, the length of the relationship. You started working with them. Now we're 9 months in. You had agreed to X% as your compensation, but now, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if you want me to continue working with you, this is what it's going to take for me to continue working with you. You can make changes then, but what you don't want to do is change it just because a listing happens to offer more than you put in your buyer agency agreement. Which is why you want to give really good thought to what you're putting in your agency agreement from the very beginning. Jane, yes, Jane is great. I don't know if she's still on. I don't have my participants list up, but Jane, now you have a couple new form numbers to remember: 725 and 804. All right, regarding seller concessions from the start of the meeting, I put 2.5% into that spot to cover my compensation when I cannot get in touch with the listing agent. Yes, that is still okay for now. So Alex is talking about back on page 1 of the offer to purchase for seller concessions. So he's just indicating that if his compensation is 2.5%, for example, with his buyer and his buyer agency agreement, then if he has not been able to get an executed form 220, then he will put 2.5% in here for seller concessions. And that means the buyer is going to be paying his compensation and the buyer is getting a concession from the seller equal to that amount. So that is perfectly acceptable. Good news is you won't have to do that for much longer because we will be able to have your compensation as part of the offer, which will make life so much easier. So happy about that. All right, any other questions? I tell you what I'm going to do then. I'm going to stop the recording. That way, if anybody has a